The millionaire decided to test the new employee by leaving the jewelry drawer open. She was deeply impacted when she saw the footage from the security cameras. New York City was buzzing with its usual energy when Samantha Rivers' private jet landed at JFK International Airport. At 45, Samantha was the epitome of success, a ruthless businesswoman, heiress to a real estate empire, and one of the most influential women in the country. Yet, as she descended the steps of the plane, her face showed a mix of exhaustion and loneliness that contrasted with her immaculate designer suit. Samantha had spent the last few weeks in Los Angeles, closing a multi-million-dollar deal that would further solidify her position in the international market. But now, back home, she felt strangely empty. Professional success did not fill the void in her personal life. Upon arriving at her luxurious mansion in Upper East Side, Samantha was greeted by Mrs. Davis, her loyal housekeeper of the last 20 years. The older woman greeted her with a warm smile, but Samantha noticed something different in her eyes. "Welcome, Ms. Rivers," Mrs. Davis said, helping her with her luggage. "I hope you had a good trip." Samantha nodded distractedly as she entered the house. "Thank you, Mrs. Davis. Everything went as planned." She paused in the foyer, noticing the tension in her employee's face. "Is everything all right?" Mrs. Davis hesitated for a moment before responding. "Ma'am, there's something I need to tell you." The older woman took a deep breath. "I've decided to retire." The news hit Samantha like a bucket of cold water. Mrs. Davis had been her rock, the only constant presence in her life since she inherited the family business after her parents' death. The thought of losing her induced a sense of panic she hadn't felt in years. "Retire, but why now?" Samantha asked, trying to maintain her composure. Mrs. Davis explained softly, "It's been many years, ma'am. My daughter just had twins, and I want to be close to help her. Besides, my bones aren't what they used to be." Samantha remained silent, processing the news. Part of her wanted to beg Mrs. Davis to stay, to offer her a raise, anything. But another part, the part that had built her empire on cold, calculated decisions, knew it was inevitable. "I understand," Samantha finally said, her voice barely a whisper. "Of course, you deserve to rest and enjoy your family. When do you plan to leave?" "In 2 weeks, if that's all right with you," Mrs. Davis replied. "I'd like to help find and train my replacement before I go." Samantha nodded mechanically. "Yes, of course we'll do that." That night, alone in her enormous bedroom, Samantha allowed herself to cry for the first time in years. It wasn't just for Mrs. Davis, it was for everything she represented. Her housekeeper's departure was a cruel reminder of how truly alone she was. The next morning, Samantha rose early, determined to face this new challenge as she did everything in her life, with efficiency and control. She called a trusted employment agency and requested that they send candidates for Mrs. Davis's position. Over the following days, Samantha interviewed several women, but none seemed suitable. Some were too young and inexperienced, others too old for the physical work the mansion required. Just when she was about to give up, the last candidate arrived. Eleanor Sanchez was 25 years old with a presence that immediately caught Samantha's attention. She was petite and shy-looking, with large brown eyes that seemed to take in everything around her. Her resume was modest, but there was something in the way she spoke, in the intelligence that shone in her eyes, that intrigued Samantha. "Why do you want this job?" Samantha asked, studying the young woman intently. Elena held her gaze. "I need the money, Ms. Rivers. I'm an orphan and have had to fend for myself since I was very young. This job would be an opportunity for me to have stability." There was a vulnerability in Elena's voice that touched something inside Samantha. She remembered her own loneliness, the emptiness she felt despite all her success. Before she could think twice, she found herself saying, "All right, Elena, the job is yours." The smile that lit up Elena's face was genuine and full of gratitude. "Thank you, Ms. Rivers, I won't let you down." As Elena left the office, Samantha remained thoughtful. There was something familiar about the young woman, though she couldn't pinpoint what. She shook her head, dismissing the idea. She was probably just projecting her own emotions onto this girl who, like her, had faced life alone. What Samantha didn't know was that Elena's arrival would mark the beginning of a series of events that would shake the foundations of her carefully constructed world. The truth she was about to discover would change her life forever, and the path to that truth began now, with the hiring of a seemingly innocent young woman who held more secrets than Samantha could imagine. The first few weeks after Mrs. Davis's departure were a period of adjustment for Samantha. Eleanor proved to be an efficient and discreet worker, quickly learning the routines of the house and her employer's preferences. However, Samantha couldn't shake a feeling of unease that followed her every time she looked at the young woman. One afternoon, while reviewing some contracts in her study, Samantha found herself watching Elena through the slightly open door. The young woman was cleaning the hallway with precise and careful movements, but there was something in her posture, in the way her eyes scanned the walls covered with family photographs, that stirred Samantha's suspicion. "This is ridiculous," she told herself, looking away. She's just a girl doing her job. But years of business had taught Samantha to trust her instincts, and her instincts were telling her something was off. That night, after Elena had retired to her room in the service wing, Samantha stayed up, tossing and turning in bed. The unease had turned into a fixed idea. She needed to know if she could trust Elena. The next day, Samantha put a plan into motion. She called Elena to her study and gave her a list of tasks that would keep her busy in other parts of the house for most of the day. Then, with her heart racing, Samantha opened the drawer where she kept her most valuable jewelry and left it slightly ajar, as if by accident. With a knot in her stomach, Samantha headed to the hidden security room behind a panel in her bedroom. There, surrounded by monitors displaying images from every corner of the mansion, she prepared to watch. The hours passed slowly. Samantha watched Elena come and go, performing her tasks with her usual efficiency. When the young woman finally entered the study to clean, Samantha held her breath. Elena moved around the room normally at first, but then her gaze stopped on the slightly open drawer. Samantha leaned forward, her eyes fixed on the screen. To her surprise, Elena didn't even approach the jewelry. Instead, the young woman seemed to hesitate for a moment before heading to the desk. With quick, nervous movements, Elena began to go through the papers on the desk. Samantha felt her blood boil as she watched her employee rummage through her private documents. But what happened next took her breath away. Elena took out her phone and began taking pictures of some documents. Then, with a furtive glance towards the door, she approached one of the shelves and took a framed photograph. It was an old image of Samantha with her parents when she was a child. Elena studied it for a long moment before taking it out of the frame and slipping it into the pocket of her uniform along with some papers. Samantha was paralyzed, unable to believe what she had just witnessed. Anger and a sense of betrayal mixed within her, clouding her judgment. Without thinking twice, she shot out of the security room and headed for her study. Elena was finishing cleaning when Samantha burst into the room, her face flushed with fury. "Thief!" Samantha shouted, making Elena jump in fright. "I saw you! I saw everything!" Elena paled, her eyes widening with a mixture of fear. And was that guilt? "Miss Rivers, I can explain," Elena began, but Samantha cut her off. "I don't want to hear your lies. I hired you, gave you a chance, and this is how you repay me. By stealing my things, spying on my documents." Elena seemed about to faint. "Please, it's not what it seems. Show me what you took," Samantha demanded, holding out her hand. With trembling hands, Elena pulled the photograph and papers from her pocket. Samantha snatched them, her eyes burning with indignation. "Why?" Samantha asked, her voice breaking with emotion. "Why would you do this?" It was then that Elena, with tears in her eyes, said the words that would change the course of their lives forever. "Because the woman in that photo is my mother, and you, Miss Rivers, are my sister." The silence that followed that statement was deafening. Samantha felt the world stop around her, Eleanor's words echoing in her ears like a distant echo. What are you saying?" Samantha managed to articulate, her voice barely a whisper. Eleanor, visibly trembling, pulled a crumpled photo from her pocket and extended it towards Samantha. "This is a photo of my mother, our mother. The same woman who is in that photo with you." Samantha took the photograph with trembling hands. It was true. The woman in the picture was unmistakably her mother, but younger than Samantha remembered, holding a baby in her arms. A baby that wasn't her. This can't be true," Samantha murmured, feeling like she couldn't breathe. "My mother never, she didn't." "I know it's hard to believe," said Elena, her voice breaking, "but it's the truth our mother gave me up for. Adoption when I was a baby. I never knew why until recently when I found a letter she left for me." Samantha sank into a chair, her mind a whirlwind of emotions and questions. How was this possible? Why would her mother have hidden the existence of another daughter? And why had Elena decided to appear now, in this way? "Why didn't you tell me from the beginning?" Samantha asked, looking up at Elena. "Why all this deception?" Elena lowered her head, ashamed. "I was scared. I didn't know how you'd react. And besides," she hesitated, as if unsure whether to continue. "Besides what?" pressed Samantha. "Besides, there's something else you need to know," said Elena, looking directly into Samantha's eyes. "Something about your family, about the business. Something that could change everything." Samantha felt a chill run down her spine. "What are you talking about?" Elena took a deep breath before continuing. "The documents I photographed, I think they show evidence of a massive fraud within the family business. A fraud orchestrated by your sister, Gabriella." Samantha's already shaky world seemed to crumble completely at those words. Gabriella, her older sister with whom she had had a tense relationship for years, involved in a fraud. It was too much to process. "I need you to explain everything," said Samantha, her voice regaining some of its usual strength. "From the beginning. And this time, no lies." Elena nodded and began to tell her story. She spoke of how she had discovered her true origins, of the letter from her mother that had led her to seek out Samantha. She explained how, in investigating the Rivers family, she had stumbled upon signs of suspicious activities within the company. "I wasn't sure how to approach you," Elena concluded. "I was afraid you wouldn't believe me, or worse, that you were involved in the fraud, so I decided to gather evidence first." Samantha listened in silence, her mind trying to process the avalanche of information. Part of her wanted to deny everything. Samantha stood up and began pacing the room, her mind working at full speed. Elena watched her in silence, expectant. "I need to see those documents," Samantha finally said, turning to Elena. "Everything you've found about this supposed fraud." Elena nodded and took out her phone. "I have photos of everything here. I also saved copies in a safe place, just in case." As Elena showed the images to Samantha, the businesswoman felt her world crumble even further. The documents seemed to show a complex web of fraudulent transactions, all leading in some way to Gabriella. "This can't be true," murmured Samantha, although deep down, a part of her wasn't entirely surprised. Gabriella had always been ambitious, even ruthless in business. But this was another level. "There's more," said Elena, her voice barely a whisper. "I found indications that our mother may have discovered something about this before she died." Samantha turned sharply to Elena. "What do you mean?" "In the letter she left me, she mentioned that there were dark secrets in the family that needed to come to light. She said she gave me up for adoption to protect me, but that one day I would have to seek the truth." Samantha sank back into the chair, overwhelmed. All this time did my mother know this was happening? "I think she did," replied Elena softly. "And I think that's why Gabriella discredited her." "Discredited? What are you talking about?" Elena took a breath before continuing. "I did some research on the last years of our mother's life. There were rumors that she was mentally unstable, that she had paranoid delusions, but now I wonder if those rumors weren't deliberately planted to silence her." Samantha closed her eyes, remembering the difficult last years of her mother. How Gabriella had insisted that she needed rest in a private clinic, away from the stress of the business. How visits had become increasingly shorter and less frequent. "Oh my God," whispered Samantha. "How could I have been so blind?" Elena cautiously approached and placed a hand on Samantha's shoulder. "It's not your fault. Gabriella seems to have been..." very careful in covering her tracks. Samantha looked up at Eleanor, seeing for the first time the resemblance to their mother. The same compassionate eyes, the same determination in the line of her jaw. "Why did you decide to seek me out now?" asked Samantha. Elena took a deep breath before responding, "Because I think Gabriella is about to make her final move. The documents suggest that she is planning a series of transactions that would effectively empty the company's accounts and divert the funds to offshore accounts." Samantha jumped to her feet. "We have to stop her." "Do you believe me then?" asked Elena, a mixture of relief and surprise in her voice. Samantha looked at her intently. "I don't know if I can believe everything about you being my sister. I'll need proof of that. But as for Gabriella, I always knew she was capable of anything for power. And these documents," she gestured towards Elena's phone, "they're too detailed to be fabricated." Elena nodded, understanding. "I'm willing to take a DNA test if necessary. But now what do we do about Gabriella?" Samantha began pacing again, her business strategist mind working at full speed. "We can't confront her directly. If she's really been planning this for years, she'll have contingencies in place. We need more evidence, irrefutable evidence." "I have an idea," said Elena, her eyes shining with determination. "But it's risky, and I'll need your help." Samantha stopped and looked at Elena, a spark of curiosity in her eyes. "I'm listening." Elena proceeded to explain her plan. It involved using her position as a domestic worker to gain access to Gabriella's office in the family mansion, where they suspected she kept crucial documents. Meanwhile, Samantha would have to distract Gabriella at a business meeting. "It's dangerous," warned Samantha, "if you're caught." "It's worth the risk," interrupted Eleanor. "For the truth, for justice for our mother." Samantha studied the young woman in front of her. Just a few hours ago, she had considered her a mere employee, then a thief. Now she was contemplating forming an alliance with her against her own sister. Life took strange turns, she thought. "All right," Samantha finally said. "Let's do it. But we're going to need help." "Who can we trust?" asked Eleanor. Samantha thought for a moment before responding. "There's someone who knew our mother better than anyone and never trusted Gabriella. I think it's time to pay a visit to my father." Elena's eyes widened. "Our father is alive?" Samantha nodded slowly. "Yes. Although I haven't spoken to him in years, Gabriella convinced him to retire early, saying he needed rest. He lives in a house in Connecticut. I think it's time we had a long family conversation." Elena swallowed nervously at the prospect of meeting her father. "Do you think he'll help us?" "If he's the man I remember, he will," replied Samantha. "And if not, well, at least we'll have answers." The two women exchanged a look, a silent understanding passing between them. In a matter of hours, their lives had changed irrevocably. Now they were united in a mission that could destroy their family or save it. "Get ready," said Samantha, her voice filled with determination. "We leave for Connecticut at dawn." As Elena nodded and went to prepare, Samantha remained alone in her study, staring at the old family photograph. Her eyes lingered on the image of her mother, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to cry. For the secrets, for the lost time, and for the sister she never knew she had. Night fell over New York City, and in the Rivers mansion, two women prepared for a journey that would change their lives forever. The truth was out there, waiting to be discovered, and they were determined to find it, no matter the cost. The sun had barely risen over the horizon when Samantha and Elena left the mansion. They had decided to travel in Samantha's personal car, a discreet black sedan, to avoid drawing attention. The trip to Connecticut would normally take about an hour and a half, but with morning traffic, they expected it to be longer. The silence in the car was palpable, filled with tension and unspoken questions. Samantha kept her eyes fixed on the road, her hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. Eleanor, for her part, looked out the window, watching as the urban landscape gradually gave way to more rural views. Finally, it was Elena who broke the silence. "What is he like? Our father, I mean..." Samantha took a moment to respond, as if she were unearthing long-buried memories. Thomas Rivers was a complicated man, brilliant in business but distant as a father. At least, that's how I remember him. When was the last time you saw him? Elena asked softly. Samantha sighed. Nearly 10 years ago, after he retired, Gabriella practically isolated him from everyone. She said he needed peace and quiet, away from the stress of the city and the business. And you didn't try to contact him. The question made Samantha visibly tense. I did, at first, but every time I tried to visit him, Gabriella had an excuse. He was tired. The doctors had recommended limiting visits. Eventually, I stopped trying. Elena nodded, processing the information. Do you think he knew about me? Samantha shook her head. I don't know my father and mother. Their relationship was complicated. There were secrets, silences. Now I wonder how much of that was related to you. Silence fell over them again, each lost in their own thoughts. The scenery outside the window became increasingly green as they approached Connecticut. After almost 2 hours of driving, Samantha finally turned onto a side street, away from the main road. She drove down a tree-lined path until they reached a large wrought-iron gate. This is it, said Samantha, stopping the car in front of the entrance. Eleanor looked at the imposing gate and the high wall surrounding the property. It looks like a fortress. In a way it is, replied Samantha as she pressed the intercom button. There was a moment of static before a gruff voice answered, yes. Samantha took a deep breath before speaking. Dad, it's me, Samantha. I need to talk to you. There was a long silence, so prolonged that for a moment Samantha feared her father would refuse to see her. But then, with an electric buzz, the gate slowly began to open. Samantha drove the car up a gravel path until they reached a large colonial-style house, grand but not ostentatious. Standing at the entrance, leaning on a cane, was Thomas Rivers. At 70, Thomas was still an imposing figure, tall and broad-shouldered with completely white hair and a well-trimmed beard. His eyes, the same dark shade as Samantha's, observed the car with a mixture of surprise and caution. Samantha turned off the engine and turned to Eleanor. Are you ready? Eleanor nodded, though her paleness betrayed her nerves. As ready as I'll ever be. Both got out of the car and approached Thomas. Samantha noticed how her father's eyes moved from her to Eleanor, a spark of recognition and shock crossing his face. Samantha, Thomas said, his voice deep and controlled. It's been a long time. Too long, Dad, Samantha replied. Then, taking a deep breath, she added, There's someone I want to introduce to you. Thomas was already staring at Eleanor, a mixture of emotions inscrutable on his face. I think I know who she is, he said quietly. Eleanor took a step forward, trembling slightly. Mr. Rivers, my name is Eleanor Sanchez, and I believe I'm your daughter. Thomas closed his eyes for a moment, as if struggling with internal pain. When he opened them again, they were bright with unshed tears. I know, he said simply. I've known since the moment I saw you. You have your mother's eyes. Samantha felt the world tilt beneath her feet. You knew all this time? Thomas nodded slowly. It's a long story, one that should have been told long ago. He gestured towards the house. Come in, I think we have a lot to talk about. As they followed Thomas into the house, Samantha and Eleanor exchanged a glance. Both knew they were about to uncover truths that could change their lives forever. The search for answers had begun, and there was no turning back. The interior of Thomas's house was a reflection of its owner, elegant but austere, with dark wood furniture and walls lined with books. He led them to a spacious study, where he indicated they should sit in a pair of leather armchairs while he settled behind an imposing desk. For a moment, no one spoke. The ticking of an old wall clock seemed to echo in the tense silence of the room. Finally, Thomas broke the silence. I suppose you have many questions, he said, his voice tired but firm. Samantha, who had been holding back her frustration since they entered the house, was the first to speak. Why, Dad? Why did you never tell me I had a sister? Thomas sighed deeply. It's a complicated story, Samantha, one that involves love, betrayal, and worst of all, cowardice. My cowardice. Elena, who had remained silent until now, leaned forward. "Please, Mr. Rivers, we need to know the truth." Thomas nodded slowly. "It all began more than 25 years ago. Your mother, Samantha, and I were going through a difficult time in our marriage. We argued constantly, mostly about my obsessive dedication to work." He paused, as if gathering strength to continue. "During that time, I made the biggest mistake of my life. I had an affair with one of the employees at the company. The affair lasted only a few months. When I realized what was at stake, what I could lose, I decided to end it, but it was too late. She was already pregnant." Samantha felt as if the air had been sucked out of the room. Elena, for her part, listened with wide eyes, absorbing every word. "What happened then?" Eleanor asked softly. Thomas closed his eyes for a moment before continuing. "I panicked. I offered her money to disappear, to go far away and never return. But she refused. She said she wanted the baby to know its father." "And Mom?" interrupted Samantha. "When did she find out?" "Your mother, Isabel, was an extraordinary woman," said Thomas, a mix of love and guilt in his voice. "Somehow, she found out everything. Instead of leaving me, as she should have, she decided she wanted to meet the woman and the baby." Elena leaned forward, eager. "My adoptive mother." Thomas shook his head. "No, Eleanor. Your biological mother, Isabel, insisted that we take responsibility for the baby, for you. She said it was the right thing to do, that we couldn't abandon you." Tears began to run down Elena's cheeks. Samantha, for her part, felt a mix of astonishment and confusion. "But then why was I adopted?" Elena asked. Thomas slowly stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the garden. "Because I was a coward, I feared the scandal, what it could do to the company's reputation, to our social standing. I convinced Isabel that the best thing to do was to give the baby up for adoption." He turned to them, his face marked by regret. "It was the biggest mistake of my life. Isabel never really forgave me, and I've lived with that guilt ever since." Samantha abruptly stood up, anger flashing in her eyes. How could you do this to all of us?" "I have no excuses, Samantha," Thomas replied, his voice broken. "All I can say is that I'm sorry, deeply sorry." Elena, who had remained silent, processing all this information, finally spoke. "But there's something I don't understand. The letter my mother left me, she talked about dark secrets in the family, about dangers. What did she mean by that?" Thomas frowned, confused. "What letter?" Samantha quickly explained about the letter Elena had found and the document suggesting a fraud within the company, orchestrated by Gabriella. Thomas's face visibly paled. "Oh my God," he murmured. "So Isabel knew. She always suspected something was wrong, but I never believed her." "What are you talking about, Dad?" Samantha asked. Feeling they were on the verge of another shocking revelation, Thomas sank heavily into his chair. "Years ago, shortly before I retired, Isabel came to me with suspicions about Gabriella. She said she had found discrepancies in the company's accounts, transactions that didn't make sense, but Gabriella had always been so brilliant in business, so dedicated, I didn't want to believe it." "What did you do?" asked Elena, though her tone suggested she feared the answer. "I made another terrible mistake," admitted Thomas. "I told Gabriella about Isabel's suspicions. She was furious. She said her mother was losing her mind, that she was paranoid, and I, God forgive me, believed her." Samantha felt the room spinning. "So when Gabriella insisted that Mum needed to rest in that clinic," Thomas nodded, tears running freely down his face. "It was a way to silence her, to keep her away from the truth, and I allowed it, because it was easier to believe that my wife was confused than to accept that my daughter might be a criminal." The silence that followed was deafening. Samantha felt as if the ground had opened up beneath her feet. Elena, for her part, struggled to process this new information that changed everything she thought she knew about her family. "And now what?" asked Elena finally. "What do we do with all this information?" Thomas straightened in his chair, a spark of determination shining in his tired eyes. "Now, we do what I should have done years ago. We face the truth, no matter how painful it is, and we do the right thing." Samantha looked at her father, then at Elena, and finally nodded. "You're right, it's time to expose Gabriella and put an end to all of this." "It won't be easy," warned Thomas. "Gabriella is cunning and has years of preparation, but together we might have a chance." The three looked at each other, united for the first time by a common purpose. The truth had come to light, painful and raw, but with it came the opportunity for redemption and justice. "Where do we start?" asked Eleanor, her voice full of determination. Samantha stood up, her strategist mind already working on a plan. "First, we need to gather all the evidence we can. Dad, we'll need your help to access the company's old records." Thomas nodded. "I'll do whatever it takes." "And then," continued Samantha, "we'll confront Gabriella, but we have to be careful. If she's really been planning this for years, she won't give up without a fight." Eleanor stood beside Samantha. "I'm ready for whatever it takes." Thomas looked at both of them, a mixture of pride and regret in his eyes. "My daughters," he said softly, "I'm so sorry for the time we've lost, for the mistakes I've made, but I promise I'll do everything in my power to make things right." Samantha and Elena exchanged a look. The road ahead would be difficult, full of dangers and complicated emotions, but for the first time in a long time, neither of them felt alone. As the sun began to set over Connecticut, the three rivers prepared for the battle ahead, a battle for truth, justice, and perhaps the redemption of a family fractured by secrets and lies. The following days were a whirlwind of frantic activity. Samantha, Eleanor, and Thomas worked tirelessly, gathering evidence, analyzing documents, and strategizing. Thomas's mansion in Connecticut became their headquarters, away from the watchful eyes of Gabriella and her possible accomplices. Samantha had taken the precaution of informing her personal assistant that she would be out of town on business to avoid raising suspicion. Eleanor, for her part, had resigned from her job as a domestic worker, citing a family emergency. As they delved deeper into the company's financial records, the scope of Gabriella's fraud became increasingly clear and alarming. Millions of dollars had been siphoned off through a complex web of shell companies and offshore accounts. What had started as small discrepancies years ago had become a massive scheme that threatened to drain the Rivers Company's assets completely. "I can't believe I didn't notice this sooner," murmured Samantha one night, rubbing her tired eyes as she reviewed another financial report. Thomas, sitting across from her, sighed heavily. "Gabriella was always brilliant with numbers. I suppose she used that talent for evil." Eleanor, who had been working on another computer nearby, approached them. "I've been tracking some of these suspicious transactions. I think I've found a pattern." Samantha and Thomas leaned in to look at the screen Elena was showing them. It displayed a complex diagram showing the flow of money through various companies. "Look," Elena pointed out, "all these transactions converge here in this account in the Cayman Islands, and guess who the ultimate beneficiary is?" "Gabriella," growled Samantha, feeling a mix of anger and sadness. Thomas removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "My God, how did it get this far? The question now is, how do we stop her?" said Elena. Samantha stood up and began pacing the room, her mind working at full speed. "We need to confront her, but in a way that she can't escape or deny everything. We need to catch her red-handed." "And how do you suggest we do that?" asked Thomas. Samantha stopped, an idea forming in her mind. "Next week is the annual shareholders meeting. All the major stakeholders will be there. It's the perfect time." Elena frowned. "Isn't that too risky? If Gabriella suspects anything, she might try to speed up her plans." "It's a risk we have to take," replied Samantha. "If we wait any longer, it could be too late." Thomas nodded slowly. "Samantha is right, and with all the shareholders present, Gabriella won't be able to deny the accusations so easily." "All right," said Elena. "What's the plan?" The three spent the next few hours perfecting their strategy. Samantha would present the evidence during the meeting, while Elena would work behind the scenes to ensure that all the evidence was ready and accessible. Thomas, for his part, would use his influence to ensure that all the key members of the board were present. The night before the meeting, Samantha found herself unable to sleep. She went out to the garden of her father's house, seeking some fresh air to calm her nerves. To her surprise, she found Eleanor already there, sitting on a bench, looking at the stars. "Can't sleep either?" asked Samantha, sitting beside her. Eleanor shook her head. "Too many thoughts running through my head." Samantha nodded, understanding perfectly. "Elena, I want you to know that no matter what happens tomorrow, I'm grateful to have met you, to have discovered the truth." Elena looked at her eyes shining with contained emotion. "Me too, Samantha. My whole life I've dreamed of having a family. I never imagined I would find it this way." The two sisters sat in silence for a moment, contemplating the stars and the path that had brought them here. "Do you think our mother would be proud?" asked Elena softly. Samantha felt a lump in her throat. "I'm sure she would be. We're doing what she always wanted, uncovering the truth and doing the right thing." They held hands, finding strength and comfort in that simple gesture. Tomorrow they would face Gabriella and fight for their families' and company's future. But tonight, under the stars, they were simply two, sisters rediscovering each other. The next morning came all too soon. Samantha, Elena, and Thomas prepared in silence, each aware of the weight of what they were about to do. When they arrived at the Rivers Company's headquarters, the building was already buzzing with activity. Shareholders, executives, and board members were coming and going from the main conference room. Gabriella was at the center of it all, greeting guests with her usual charm and confidence. When she saw Samantha arrive with Thomas and Elena, a brief expression of surprise crossed her face before being replaced by a perfectly rehearsed smile. "Samantha, Dad, what a surprise to see you together," said Gabriella, approaching them. Her eyes lingered on Elena with curiosity. "And who is this young lady?" Samantha felt her heart race, but she maintained her composure. "I'll explain everything during the meeting. Gabriella, I think we all have a lot to talk about." Gabriella narrowed her eyes slightly, as if trying to read between the lines. "Of course," she finally said. "We'd better go in. The meeting is about to start." As they followed Gabriella into the conference room, Samantha exchanged a look with Elena and Thomas. There was no turning back now. It was time for the truth. The meeting began with the usual reports and financial projections. Gabriella, as always, dominated the presentation with her charisma and apparent mastery of the numbers. But Samantha could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes nervously darted around the room. Finally, the moment they had been waiting for arrived. Samantha stood up, feeling all eyes on her. "Ladies and gentlemen of the board," she began, her voice firm despite the nerves she felt. "I have information that will change everything you believe you know about the current state of our company." Gabriella tensed visibly. "Samantha, what are you talking about?" Samantha ignored the interruption and continued. "Over the past few years, our company has been the victim of massive fraud. Millions of dollars have been diverted into personal accounts through a web of shell companies." A murmur of shock ran through the room. Gabriella stood up abruptly. "That's ridiculous. Do you have proof of these absurd accusations?" "As a matter of fact, I do," replied Samantha, signaling to Eleanor, who began distributing folders containing the evidence they had gathered. What followed was a detailed presentation of all the evidence they had compiled. Samantha meticulously laid out each suspicious transaction, each hidden account, each manipulation of the accounting books. As she spoke, she could see Gabriella's face growing paler and paler. "And the ultimate beneficiary of this entire scheme," Samantha concluded, looking directly at her sister, "is Gabriella Rivers." Chaos erupted in the room. The shareholders shouted questions, demanding explanations. Gabriella, for the first time in her life, seemed at a loss for words. This is a conspiracy," Gabriella finally managed to say, her voice trembling. "Samantha is jealous of my success. She's trying to discredit me." It was then that Thomas stood up. "No, Gabriella, it's the truth, and it's time we all faced it." Gabriella looked at her father, betrayal written in her eyes. "Dad, you too? How can you believe these lies?" "Because I helped uncover them," Elena interjected, stepping forward. "My name is Elena Sanchez Rivers. I'm your sister, Gabriella, the daughter our parents gave up for adoption years ago." The silence that followed this revelation was deafening. Gabriella looked at Elena, then at Samantha. and finally at Thomas, shock and confusion evident on her face. This can't be true," murmured Gabriella, but her voice lacked conviction. "It is true, Gabriella," said Samantha softly. "The same truth that Mom tried to reveal years ago before you silenced her." Tears began to stream down Gabriella's cheeks. I just wanted to prove my worth, to show that I was as capable as you, Samantha, that I deserved to run this company." "But at what cost, Gabriella?" Thomas responded, his voice filled with sadness. "You betrayed your family. You put the legacy of generations at risk." As the board members began calling for immediate action, including a full audit and possible intervention by the authorities, Samantha approached her sister Gabriella. She said quietly, "There's still time to do the right thing, cooperate, help us undo the damage you've caused." For a moment, Gabriella seemed to consider the offer, but then, with a quick movement, she pulled out her phone and pressed a button. "I'm sorry, Samantha," she said, a bitter smile on her lips, "but I always have a backup plan." Suddenly, the lights in the room flickered and went out. The computer screens went black. When the emergency lights came on, Gabriella had disappeared. "She's activated some kind of virus in our systems," one of the IT technicians shouted. Samantha turned to Elena and Thomas, determination blazing in her eyes. "This isn't over. We'll find her and stop her." As chaos continued around them, Samantha, Elena, and Thomas stood united. They had faced the truth. They had exposed the lie, but their fight was far from over. The confrontation was over, but the real battle for the future of the Rivers family and its legacy was just beginning. The hours that followed Gabriella's dramatic escape were a whirlwind of frantic activity. The police were called, emergency audits were initiated, and the company's IT systems were quarantined to contain the virus that Gabriella had released. Samantha, Elena, and Thomas were in Samantha's private office, trying to make sense of everything that had happened and plan their next move. "I can't believe she had such an elaborate escape plan," said Elena, pacing nervously around the room. Samantha nodded, her face a mask of concentration. "Gabriella was always cautious. We should have anticipated that she would have an exit strategy." Thomas, who had been silent until that moment, spoke with a tired voice. "The question is, where would she go? She must know that all her known accounts will be frozen." At that moment, Samantha's phone rang. It was the company's head of security. "Ms. Rivers, we've managed to trace your sister's last phone movement. It seems she was heading to the airport." Samantha hung up and looked at Elena and Thomas. "The airport. It makes sense. She's probably trying to leave the country." "But where?" asked Elena. Samantha thought for a moment, and then her eyes lit up with realization. "The Cayman Islands. That's where the main account she used for the fraud is located. I bet she has emergency funds there that we couldn't trace." "We need to stop her before she leaves the country," said Thomas, standing up, with determination. Samantha nodded. "Elena, I need you to stay here and coordinate with the IT team. Try to regain control of our systems and see if you can find more clues about Gabriella's plans." Elena nodded, though she seemed reluctant to part from them. "Dad," Samantha continued, "you and I will go to the airport. I have contacts there who can help us track her down." As they headed to the parking lot, Samantha made several calls, mobilizing all the resources at her disposal. The drive to the airport was tense, with Thomas and Samantha deep in their own thoughts. "I never thought it would come to this," murmured Thomas at one point. "My daughters, one chasing the other." Samantha gripped the steering wheel tightly. "It's not your fault, Dad. Gabriella made her own choices." When they arrived at the airport, they were met by the head of security, who quickly led them to a control room. "We've checked all the passenger lists for the flights that have left in the past few hours," the head of security reported. "There's no record of Gabriella Rivers." "She must be using an alias," said Samantha. "Is there any flight scheduled for the Cayman Islands?" The head of security quickly checked his tablet. "There's one that's about to take off from the private terminal." Samantha and Thomas exchanged glances. "It's her," they said in unison. What followed was a race against time. Samantha and Thomas ran through the airport, followed by security agents. When they arrived at the private terminal, they saw a private jet beginning to move on the runway. "No," Samantha shouted, pounding the window in frustration, but then, as if fate had decided to intervene, the plane suddenly stopped on the runway. Over the airport's loudspeakers, an announcement was heard. "Attention all pilots and ground personnel. A security alert has been issued. No aircraft is allowed to take off until further notice." Samantha looked at her father in astonishment. "How?" Thomas smiled weakly. "Let's just say I still have some contacts in high places." Minutes later, security agents surrounded the private jet Gabriella was escorted off the plane, her face a mixture of fury and defeat, as Gabriella passed by Samantha and Thomas. She paused for a moment. "I suppose I should congratulate you," she said bitterly. "You've won." Samantha looked at her sister, feeling a mix of sadness and relief. It wasn't about winning, Gabriella. It was about doing the right thing. As Gabriella was led away by the agents, Samantha turned to her father. "It's over," she said softly. Thomas nodded, tears in his eyes. "Yes, but it's also a new beginning. For all of us." Back at the office, Eleanor greeted them with encouraging news. The IT team had managed to contain the virus and was in the process of recovering the company's systems. "We also found something interesting," Elena added. "It seems that Gabriella kept a digital diary. It might help us understand why she did all this." Samantha nodded, exhausted but relieved. "We'll go over it tomorrow. For now, I think we all need to rest." As they prepared to leave, Samantha looked around at her father, tired but with a new determination in his eyes. At Elena, her newly discovered sister, who had proven to be an invaluable ally. And she thought of Gabriella, whose actions had triggered all of this. The Rivers family had been shaken to its core, but somehow Samantha felt they were now more united than ever. The road to recovery and reconciliation would be long and difficult, but for the first time in a long time, Samantha felt hope for the future. The months following Gabriella's arrest were a time of intense work and reflection for the Rivers family. The company faced an unprecedented crisis of confidence, and Samantha, along with Elena and Thomas, worked tirelessly to restore the integrity and reputation of the family business. Elena proved to be an invaluable addition to the team. Her fresh perspective and technological skills were crucial. In implementing new systems of control and transparency in the company, Samantha, for her part, focused on reassuring investors and renegotiating key contracts. Thomas, though technically retired, became a valuable advisor, sharing his experience and helping navigate the complex waters of the business recovery. One afternoon, as they reviewed the latest financial reports in Samantha's office, Elena mentioned something that had been on everyone's mind. Have you read Gabriella's diary?" Samantha and Thomas exchanged glances. They had been putting off that moment, fearful of what they might discover. "I think it's time," Samantha finally said. Together, the three sat in front of the computer, where Gabriella's digital diary had been recovered. As they read, a complex and painful portrait of their sister began to emerge. Gabriella wrote about feeling constantly overshadowed by Samantha, about her desperation to prove her worth to a father she perceived as distant. She talked about how the first diversion of funds had been almost accidental, a way to show that she could be as shrewd in business as her younger sister. But what impacted them the most was an entry dated shortly after Isabel, Samantha and Gabriella's mother, began suspecting the fraud. "Mum came to me today, worried about some discrepancies she found in the books. For a moment, I considered confessing everything, but fear paralyzed me. If the truth came out, I would lose everything I had worked for. I can't allow that, God forgive me, but I can't stop now." Samantha felt tears running down her cheeks. Elena, sitting beside her, took her hand in a silent gesture of support. Thomas removed his glasses and rubbed his tired eyes. So much pain, so many misunderstandings. If only we had spoken openly. "We can't change the past," said Samantha softly, "but we can learn from it." In the following weeks, Samantha began visiting Gabriella in prison. At first, the encounters were tense and filled with uncomfortable silences, but gradually the sisters began to talk, to unearth old wounds, and try to understand each other. "I never meant to hurt anyone," Gabriella confessed during one of these visits. "I just wanted to be seen, valued." Samantha nodded, for the first time truly understanding her sister. "I know, and I'm sorry I didn't realize how much you were hurting." Meanwhile, Eleanor and Thomas worked on their own relationship. They spent time together, sharing stories and building the father-daughter bond that had been denied them for so many years. One afternoon, as they walked through the garden of Thomas's house, Eleanor stopped by a rose bush. "Mom, my adoptive mother used to have a rose garden," she said nostalgically. Thomas smiled gently. "Isabel loved roses too. Maybe you could help me take care of these. It would be a way to honor both mothers." Eleanor nodded, tears in her eyes, but a smile on her lips. As the months passed, the company began to recover. The new transparency policies implemented by Samantha and Elena gained the trust of investors and customers. The press, which had initially been ruthless with the scandal, now praised the resilience and integrity of the new leadership at Rivers Inc. A year after the day of the confrontation, the Rivers family gathered at Thomas's house for dinner. Gabriella, who had been released on bail pending her trial, was present, though visibly nervous. As they sat at the table, an awkward silence fell over the group. It was Elena who finally spoke. "I know we've been through a lot and that we still have a long way to go. But I want you to know that I'm grateful. Grateful to have found my family, even under these circumstances." Samantha raised her glass. To family, to truth, and to second chances. Everyone, even Gabriella, raised their glasses in a silent toast. As the dinner progressed, the tension began to dissipate. There were laughs, some tears, and many honest conversations. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Later that night, Samantha found herself in the garden, looking at the stars. Elena joined her. "What are you thinking about?" asked Elena. Samantha smiled softly. "About how much has changed in a year, about how much we've lost, and how much we've gained." Elena nodded, understanding. "Do you think we'll ever be a normal family?" Samantha laughed softly. "I don't think normal is a word that applies to the Rivers family. But I think we can be a united family in our own way." As the sisters shared that moment under the stars, both felt a sense of peace they hadn't experienced in a long time. The road to healing and reconciliation was still long, but for the first time, it seemed possible. The story of the Rivers family was one of secrets, betrayal, and pain. But it was also a story of redemption, of second chances, and the healing power of truth. And as Samantha and Elena looked to the future, they knew that no matter what happened, they would face whatever came together.